Most people think they know Jerusalem. What they actually know is a cleaned-up, stained glass version that leaves out the noise, the smell, the political terror, and the staggering inequality that made the city one of the most explosive places in human history. Jesus did not walk through a peaceful, picturesque Holy Land. He walked through a city under brutal Roman occupation, controlled by a corrupt religious elite, bursting at the seams with 300,000 pilgrims desperate for liberation, all while the most powerful empire on earth watched from fortress walls with swords drawn. The crucifixion and resurrection did not happen despite this chaos. They happened because of it. And understanding the world that produced these events will change the way you read every line of the story. Start with the ground itself, because Jerusalem's location was not chosen for beauty. It was chosen for survival. The city sits on a narrow limestone ridge 750 meters above the Judean desert, flanked on three sides by steep valleys: the Kidron to the east, the Hinnom to the south and west. The only approach that did not require climbing a near vertical slope was from the north, and that is exactly where every invader in history attacked. The geology made the city a natural fortress, but it also made it something else: a choke point on the only viable trade route connecting the coastal plain to the Jordan Valley and the kingdoms beyond. Whoever held Jerusalem controlled the road between Egypt and Mesopotamia. That is why Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans all fought for this specific hilltop. It was not just sacred, it was strategic. And by the time of Jesus, both realities occupied the same stones: a city where heaven and earth were believed to touch, and where the iron machinery of empire ground forward without pause. Herod the Great had spent decades transforming Jerusalem into a showpiece designed to impress Rome and intimidate his own people simultaneously. The temple complex alone covered 36 acres, roughly 20 football fields. The retaining walls were built with stones weighing over 100 tons each, fitted without mortar, without cranes, using nothing but human ingenuity, forced labor, and a king with an almost pathological need to prove himself. Ancient writers described the temple as one of the wonders of the world. Josephus wrote that it gleamed so brilliantly in the morning sun that looking directly at it was like looking at the sun itself. The walls of white limestone, the golden roof, the colonnaded courtyards, the entire structure was a theological statement in stone. The God of Israel dwells here, and nothing you have ever seen compares. But beneath the gold, the architecture told a harder story. The complex was organized into nested courts, each more restricted than the last. The court of the Gentiles, the outermost ring, was the one space where non-Jews could enter. Beyond it, a stone barrier with inscriptions in Greek and Latin warned that any Gentile who crossed the line would be responsible for his own death. Two of these warning stones have been found by archaeologists. They are not metaphors, they are carved threats. Beyond the barrier, the court of women, then the court of Israel, then the court of the priests, and finally, the Holy of Holies, a chamber entered by one man, once a year, on the Day of Atonement. The closer you got to God, the fewer people were allowed. And this hierarchy was not merely spiritual. It was enforced by guards, by gates, and by a priestly aristocracy that controlled access the way a monopoly controls a market. Which is exactly what they did. Over time, the court of the Gentiles, that sacred outer space meant to be a house of prayer for all nations, had been converted into a commercial operation. Money changers sat at tables exchanging foreign coins into the Tyrian shekels required for the temple tax, at exchange rates they set. Vendors sold pre-approved sacrificial animals at inflated prices to pilgrims who had traveled hundreds of miles and had no alternative. The system was run by the family of the high priest Annas. It was a religious monopoly that served the top brilliantly and bled everyone else dry. And then one morning, a carpenter from Galilee walked in and flipped the tables. The sound of coins scattering across ancient stone and animals breaking free into the crowd was one of the most dangerous moments in the entire story, because the men who ran that operation heard the message with absolute clarity. This man is threatening our income. From that moment, the decision to kill Jesus was not theological. It was economic. But the temple was not just a marketplace. During Passover, it became something closer to an industrial operation running at absolute maximum capacity. Josephus records that under Nero, over 256,000 lambs were sacrificed in a single Passover. 20,000 priests served in 24 rotating divisions. Worshippers brought their lamb, the priest slaughtered it. The blood was caught in a bowl, passed hand to hand along a chain of priests, and dashed against the base of the altar. The drainage channels ran red. The blood flowed so thick it was channeled down into the Kidron Valley below. The smoke of burning fat and incense hung over the city for days. This was not solemn, quiet worship. This was visceral, overwhelming, and physically exhausting for everyone involved. And it is the precise backdrop against which the crucifixion occurred. When the Gospel writers called Jesus the Lamb of God, every person in Jerusalem that week understood the image with their entire body. The smell of blood, the sound of the temple choir, the sight of crimson flowing through stone channels. The one who was crucified outside the walls died at the same hour the Passover lambs were being slaughtered inside them. Now, step outside the temple and into the streets. And understand that Jerusalem was two cities stacked on top of each other. The upper city, the western hill, higher in elevation, was where the priestly aristocracy lived. Archaeologists have uncovered these mansions, multi-story structures with imported mosaic floors, frescoed walls, private ritual baths, gardens, and enough storage jars to survive a siege. One excavated mansion, known as the Palatial Mansion, covered over 600 square meters. These people were not struggling. They were the families who controlled the temple economy, sat on the Sanhedrin, and negotiated with Rome from a position of considerable comfort. 5 minutes downhill, the story was different. The lower city, the eastern slope descending toward the Kidron Valley, was where artisans, day laborers, and small merchants lived in houses with dirt floors and a single oil lamp for light. A sandal maker or a stone cutter worked from sunrise to sundown and still went to bed wondering if tomorrow's bread was guaranteed. One illness, one bad season, one political shift, and the line between poverty and slavery was terrifyingly thin. The Roman taxation system, layered upon the temple tithes and fees already extracted, was designed, whether intentionally or not, to keep the powerful exactly where they were. And the bodies of the poor told the story. This is the block that rarely appears in any reconstruction of ancient Jerusalem, but it should. A day laborer working on Herod's construction projects, and the temple complex was under continuous construction for decades, employing thousands, carried limestone blocks in the heat of the Judean summer. Temperatures reached 40 degrees Celsius. The stone dust coated the lungs. The blocks weighed hundreds of kilograms and were moved with ropes, levers, and raw human muscle. Hands cracked, backs bent permanently, knees ground down on stone. A man who had spent 20 years hauling blocks for Herod's temple would have looked old at 35, stooped, scarred, his joints swollen, his breathing labored from calcium dust that had been settling in his chest since adolescence. And this man's labor paid for the golden walls that the priests walked past every morning on their way to sacrifice. The inequality of Jerusalem was not just visible in the architecture, it was written in the bodies of the men who built it. Beneath those streets, beneath the houses, beneath the temple platform itself, lay another city that almost no one saw. Jerusalem's underground infrastructure was vast, ancient, and essential. Cisterns carved into the limestone bedrock stored hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of water, fed by aqueducts stretching over 20 kilometers from springs in the Judean hills. An engineering marvel that still could not fully meet the demand of a swollen festival population. Hezekiah's tunnel, cut through 533 meters of solid rock 700 years before Jesus, diverted the Gihon Spring underground to protect the water supply during a Syrian siege. Workers cutting from opposite ends met in the middle. The inscription describing their breakthrough was found in 1880 and remains one of the oldest Hebrew inscriptions ever discovered. The tunnel still carries water today. Quarries beneath the northern wall provided the limestone for Herod's construction. Some of these underground chambers are enormous. The largest, known as Solomon's Quarries or Zedekiah's Cave, extends over 200 meters beneath the old city, with ceilings high enough to stand in and tool marks still visible on the walls where blocks were cut thousands of years ago. And during times of crisis, Roman crackdowns, political arrests, the final siege of 70 AD, these tunnels and cisterns became hiding places, escape routes, and tombs. The Siloam Tunnel, the Warren's shaft system, the network of passages beneath the temple platform itself, all of it formed a shadow city below the visible one. The Jerusalem that visitors saw was stone and gold and smoke. The Jerusalem that kept it alive was carved darkness and flowing water, invisible to everyone who didn't need it. And death was never far. Just outside the city walls, Roman law prohibited execution and burial within them. The landscape was dotted with tombs cut into the soft limestone hillsides. Wealthy families owned elaborate burial caves with multiple chambers. The body was laid on a stone shelf, anointed with spices, wrapped in linen, and left to decompose for approximately a year. Then the bones were gathered and placed in a small stone box called an ossuary, roughly 2 feet long, just large enough to hold the longest bones. Thousands of these ossuaries have been found across the Jerusalem hills. Some bear scratched names: Simon, Mary, Joseph, Judah, the common names of first-century Jerusalem, the same names that appear in the Gospels. One, famously controversial, bears the inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. The burial industry was a significant part of the city's economy. Stonemasons cut the tombs, a process that could take weeks of chiseling into the hillside. Spice merchants sold the myrrh and aloes used for anointing. Nicodemus brought 75 pounds for the burial of Jesus, a quantity that signaled enormous expense and honor. Linen dealers provided the wrapping cloths. Professional mourners were hired for the funeral procession. Death was not hidden in first-century Jerusalem. It was visible, physical, commercial, and constant. The tombs were right there, carved into every hillside you passed when you left the city gates. You walked past the dead on the way to the market. You walked past the dead on the way to the temple. And Golgotha, the place of the skull, was deliberately positioned near a major road so that every traveler entering or leaving the city would see the crosses and understand what Rome did to those who challenged its authority. Crucifixion was not just execution. It was advertisement. The bodies hung for hours, sometimes days, visible to every person who passed. The message was not subtle. This is what happens. The location of Jesus' death was not a remote hillside. It was a billboard. The valley of Hinnom, Gehenna, ran along the southwestern wall. Jerusalem's garbage dump, where waste burned continuously, producing a column of smoke visible for miles, and a smell that embedded itself in memory. When Jesus spoke about Gehenna, he did not need to invent a metaphor. Everyone in the city could glance over the wall and see exactly what he meant. Fire that did not go out, smoke that did not stop. A valley where everything discarded was consumed. The image worked because it was real. During Passover, this already volatile city swelled to 4 times its normal population. 80,000 residents became 300,000. Every inn was full, every rooftop rented, every spare room packed with pilgrims who had walked for days, from Egypt, from Babylon, from the diaspora communities of Asia Minor and Greece. The Mount of Olives became a tent city. Thousands of families huddled together under the stars, cooking over small fires, singing the psalms of ascent, the ancient songs pilgrims sang as they climbed the final miles toward Jerusalem. Children ran between the tents. Donkeys were tethered at every available post. The smell of wood smoke and roasting lamb drifted down the hillside and mixed with the incense from the temple. The markets overflowed. Prices spiked. Vendors who understood the Passover economy charged accordingly. A bottle of water, a measure of grain, a place to sleep. Everything cost 3, 4, 5 times the normal rate. The narrow streets became rivers of humanity flowing toward the temple. Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and a dozen regional dialects collided in the air. A Roman soldier barking orders, a merchant haggling over spices, a pilgrim from Alexandria singing a psalm in Hebrew, and somewhere in the background, a goat expressing its opinion about the whole situation. That was Jerusalem's soundtrack during festival season, and it played from before sunrise until well after dark. And the atmosphere was not merely festive, it was electric with political expectation. Passover celebrated liberation from Egypt, and these people were living under occupation. The songs of freedom were not historical nostalgia. They were prayers for the present tense. Every family that slaughtered a lamb and painted its blood on memory was reliving a night when God struck the empire that enslaved them. Roman soldiers, posted on the walls of the Antonia fortress directly overlooking the temple courts, watched the crowd with the wariness of men who understood that a religious festival celebrating liberation held by a conquered people was a situation with no margin for error. And into this pressure cooker walked Jesus of Nazareth, on a donkey, down the Mount of Olives, with a crowd shouting, "Hosanna!" which means, "Save us now!" The Pharisees told him to silence them. "If they keep quiet," he answered, "the stones will cry out." Pilate, watching from the fortress, was not smiling. A messianic parade entering the city of David during the Feast of Liberation was exactly the kind of event that made Roman governors reach for contingency plans. What followed was the most consequential week in human history. Monday, the tables overturned in the temple, coins ringing across the stone floor, animals breaking free into the crowd, the Sanhedrin watching from the shadows with a fury that had nothing to do with theology. Tuesday, public debates with Pharisees and Sadducees in the temple courts, where Jesus reduced the most learned scholars of the generation to silence, then walked out and said quietly to his disciples, "Not one stone of this building would be left standing on another." They looked at the 100-ton blocks and could not imagine it. 40 years later, Roman soldiers would fulfill that sentence with terrifying precision. Wednesday, silence. The Gospels record nothing. One day of stillness in the eye of the storm. Thursday, the Last Supper in a borrowed upper room, the washing of feet. Work so degrading Jewish law exempted even Hebrew slaves from it. The bread broken, the wine poured, the words that 2 billion people still repeat. This is my body. This is my blood. Judas stepped into the night. That night, Gethsemane, the olive grove where Jesus sweated blood, the torches through the trees, the kiss, the sword, the healing of the severed ear, and then every disciple running into the darkness. Friday, 6 trials in 18 hours, every one of them illegal under both Jewish and Roman law. Pilate's calculation, the crowd's reversal, the scourging with leather and bone, the crown of thorns, the purple cloak of mockery, the cross carried through streets he had walked as a free man days before, and at 9 in the morning, the nails. 6 hours of slow asphyxiation, while inside the temple walls, the Passover lambs were being slaughtered. At 3 in the afternoon, it is finished. The temple curtain, 60 feet tall, thick as a man's palm, tore from top to bottom. The earth shook. Saturday, the longest day in human history. A sealed tomb, Roman guards, and the absolute certainty among everyone who had followed him that it was over. And then, Sunday, an empty tomb, a folded cloth, a woman's name spoken by a voice she recognized, and everything changed. 40 years later, in 70 AD, Titus surrounded Jerusalem with 4 legions. Josephus, who witnessed it, described suffering so extreme that even soldiers were shaken. The city that had welcomed 300,000 pilgrims was now trapped, starving, and burning. The temple, that breathtaking, impossible structure, was set ablaze. Gold melted into the cracks between the stones. Roman soldiers dismantled it block by block to extract the metal. Not one stone was left on another. The prophecy spoken on a Tuesday afternoon 40 years earlier was fulfilled with devastating precision. Jerusalem was eventually plowed under and rebuilt as a Roman city called Aelia Capitolina. The world that had produced the crucifixion and resurrection simply ceased to exist. But the story had already escaped the walls. Paul had carried it to Athens, Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome itself before the first legionary lit his torch. Peter had preached in Jerusalem on Pentecost and watched 3,000 respond in a single afternoon. The message the Sanhedrin thought they had contained had spread through the Roman Empire's own road network with the speed of fire in dry grass. The empire's infrastructure had become the delivery system for the faith that would outlast it. The city of crucifixion became, against every calculation, the birthplace of the global church. And 2,000 years later, the stones are still there. The Western Wall, the last surviving retaining wall of Herod's platform, still holds the prayers that people press between its cracks. The tunnels beneath the old city still carry water. The Mount of Olives still looks down on the temple platform. And every year at Passover, the question is still asked: why is this night different from all other nights? The answer that Jerusalem gave, in blood, in stone, in an empty tomb on a Sunday morning, has not been withdrawn. It is still standing, and it is still waiting. What struck you most? The temple economy, the laborers' bodies, the underground city, or the destruction? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one.